we can now move to our final plenary discussion, and we are very honored to have Mark Pearce to able to help us to chair this session. So Mark, I hand over the stage to you, and you can speak.
Thank you,
Mark.
Gary. Yeah. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed this morning. I know some of the debate was us niggling about different variables, but I think it was very stimulating to think about simulation, if I may be allowed a little word game. When I was asked to chair this discussion, I realized that it's actually quite a difficult thing to do, because we started this conference on the 19th of November with Roland Hardenberg's lecture. This is the fourth of the sessions, and I suppose some of you will be like me, getting old, and so your short-term memory isn't that good. And so what I did was I went back and I had a look at my notes and at the abstracts of the various contributions that have been made. And so I'm going to try just for 5 minutes, and I won't take too much time, but for 5 minutes, I just want to remind you of some of the things that have been said over the course of the last 2 months. And I'm afraid that that reminder will be quite a personal thing. I've picked out the things that struck me as interesting or important. So please forgive me if my personal view is not the same as yours. And we started off on the 19th of November with Roland Hardenberg's lecture on perspectives on resources. And he told us a little bit about the history of the concept of resource, which developed in the mid-18th century. Resources are things of value which are an input in production. And he talked a bit about Bourdieu, resources as types of capital. He talked a bit about Marshall Sahlins' view of resources acquiring their meaning within the framework of culturally shaped practical interests. And he also talked, and I thought this was quite important, particularly for today, about the importance of landscape as a resource complex, and the contrast with the concept of environment, which is the place of interaction. And then he talked a bit about resource assemblages and resource cultures. So that was an introduction to the concept of resources. And then the following day, we had our first session, which was Life Worlds in Resource Landscapes. And that started off with a keynote by Timothy Kane, which he entitled Resources as Landscapes, as Life Worlds. How do material resources shape lives and shape minds? And he started off by talking about Bruno Latour and actor network theory. Now, if you go to the introduction to the volume, the Metallo volume, that contains the abstracts of all the papers that we've heard over the last 4 sessions, you'll find a very interesting piece by Thomas Stollner, where he too mentions Bruno Latour and actor network theory and some of the other ideas that are put forward in Reassembling the Social, which is a very, very difficult read if you've not done so yet. And that question was brought up again today by Matteo Cantizano, when he asked the question about whether non-humans can be actors in the models that we heard about this morning. Now, why is Latour important? Well, Latour's important because I think that one of the things that we've really got to be interested in is that dynamic relationship between humans and their environment. Timothy Kane talked a bit about human niche construction. Organisms shape their environments, but the niches shape and define the organism. So it's a sort of two-way process with resources. I gave a paper in that first session about ritual and resource procurement. I won't talk about that, but there were 3 other papers. One was by Rafael Asa, who talked about iron smelting landscapes in Elba. He talked a little bit about the organization of production, about sites being along the coast. And he talked about a particular resource, which was wine and the consumption of wine within the context of iron production. Then Tina Asmussen talked about resource landscapes of 16th and early 17th century mining. Again, a lot of emphasis on resource landscapes. And she said something very, very interesting, what struck me as very interesting, about Agricola. Because the woodcuts in Agricola, as she pointed out, show a transformed landscape. Nature converted into a productive resource through labor. And so mining in that ideology becomes both a practical, but also a moral undertaking, mining as a vocation. And then finally, in that first session, we heard Lena Asri talking about knowing stones and handling deposits, 1000 to 1500 AD, reflections on a history of the knowledge of mineable georesources. And she asked a very interesting question, which is, what criteria did people use to decide where to mine? How did they understand the resources that they had? How did they understand their landscape? Okay, so that's just a rapid run through of the first session. The second session was about skill, embodiment, and the growth of knowledge. And that started off with a very interesting keynote by Trevor Marchand. And I'm very glad that Valentine Roux is here this morning, because actually what Trevor said riffed with and interplayed with a ReSoc seminar that we had a year or so ago about learning and about apprenticeship and other things. So Trevor Marchand talked about practical apprenticeship, about skill learning and traditional crafts. And he talked about his specific fieldwork, which was an apprenticeship style method where he exchanged his own toil for ethnographic knowledge. And he talked about learning, what learning is, learning as situated perceptual experience and physical activity. He talked about the crucial aspects of imagination, and he talked about how people learn, learning as a result of realization that a mistake has been made. Now, what struck me about that keynote and its relationship to the first session and its relationship to the ReSoc workshop was the concept that knowledge is not necessarily communicated. Apprentices have to fight, and that's how Trevor put it. They have to fight to get knowledge. And in fact, Bruno Latour talks about how knowledge is communicated in his metaphor of translation, and how specific agents are not intermediaries, they're mediators, and how they change knowledge. Whereas one of the interesting things that came out of the ReSoc seminar that Valentine was one of the important speakers at, was how actually knowledge is hidden, how people don't want to give out knowledge, how learning is a struggle. Learning is a struggle to acquire it. We also heard another keynote from Michael Kuipers from Leiden, who talked about skills. He used a chaîne opératoire approach, and he talked about the importance of perceptive categories, skill as engagement with and response to materials. So again, we have agency of the material itself. He talked about the importance of the body and the importance of tools. And he talked about the importance of explicit cognitive knowledge and embodied knowledge. And he used a very interesting case study about how craft workers perceive composition when they're working in metal. And as he pointed out, that's based on color. Then we had three papers. We had a paper from Nadia Melko, Knowledge, Skill and the Senses, she looked at knowledge and skill through the lens of Roman provincial pottery making in northern Switzerland. Then we had a paper by Sarah Finlayson and Julia Wild, who talked about gem manufacture. They're a very long title, but it was basically about gem manufacture in Ida Oberstein in Germany, compared with the Bronze Age Aegean. And what I got from that was the importance of the family in workshop practices, and how family relationships are used to tightly control access to knowledge. So knowledge and skills are not open to everybody, they're very tightly controlled. And they also talked about the wide range of roles within a workshop. The second paper was Nicolas Papadimitriou and Arkis Gumas, who also talked about gem making, or well, gold embroidery in this case. They talked about they talked about Arkis's experiences in reproducing the pommels of Mycenaean swords. And I thought that there were two key things that Arkis and Nicolas said. One was that technical advances required the creation of new tools. And the other was about how the visual perception of artists increased through time as Arkis worked on reproducing these pommels with the sword pommels with the gold embroidery. So manual skill only plays a very small part in craft skill as a whole. And then the third paper was Trifon Giakoulis's paper on how local resources were used in the construction of a lake village and trackways at Anagi Ixpe in Western Macedonia. So that was the second session. The third session was the general session, and there were some interesting papers again here. I was very struck by the paper that Milena Müller-Kissing gave us about the concept of urban mining, and about the concept that waste is also a resource. One man's trash is another man's treasure. That's one of the papers that research group has published in PLOS ONE. Waste is not just discarded, but it's regularly used as a resource. And then there were 4 posters, one by Abdelmoniam Goma on black resin in the New Kingdom, Egypt, Rafael Davela on transhumance in Irpinia, where she saw the transhumance as a dynamic network of tangible and intangible resources, of actants and social cultural dynamics. And she talked a bit about the preliminary results of that study. Then we heard Reuven Turk and Carla Nussli on copper technology in the Grisons. And they looked at how slag tempering was an identity symbol in the Inn Valley, and looked at the various types of pottery temper and what they can tell us about the origin of the miners who mined in the Oberhalbstein in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age. And then finally, we heard Tudor Valkev, who talked to us about prehistoric spondylus from a village in Bulgaria. Now, that's really quite a disparate set of papers, and we've got 4 separate sessions. I think that what brings them all together, of course, is the concept of resources and what that means, and I think that's one thing we ought to discuss. But I also think that the issue of the social role of the resource itself, and perhaps Bruno Latour's actor network theory, which came out in those early sessions, might also be something that we can do, we can think about. So I wonder if there are any general points about resources, or any general points about some of the things that were said through this 2 months of thinking and reading and listening. So it's over to everybody else really now. Does anybody want to jump in?
Mark, thank you very much for this very, very good and very comprehensive summarizing of all our topics. And there's the question of appropriation and the question of affordance you put out with your question, and also Matteo did, is certainly an important point. And it brings me to the point of narratives, which we have to consider also as a resource. And Mike Rose does know we have discussed this recently also during debates on your rural university, but this brings me more to the point how we consider narratives in a past perspectives. And of course we are all aware about the problems of the rational choice decisions, for instance, yeah, and we have seen this today as well. And this would have been also my question to the ABM people today, how we go to the narratives of decision making in past societies. We all as archaeologists and historians would possibly agree that each society, community, we could also call it culture, would develop its own strategies in decision making, and not only how to do it in a practice way, but also in the spirits which are behind the experiences and so on and so forth. And this very much would influence the way, for instance, for economic decisions, the path dependency is somehow selected to go on. And I would wonder how we could not come to more debate on that, also in a way of simulating these points. For instance, if I think on an antique society, of course we could, or even you, Mark, you did raise the question of ethnographic sources. Of course we could think a bit more about the internal, let's say, spirits that are decisive for taking a decision in a certain direction, and bring it into the simulation. So it's neither a rational, what we not would regard a rational choice would have been possibly one in scope of the cultural embedding of a group. So I would like to know a bit more from the ABM people, how they would learn their systems in these special cultural habits in order to get a better idea. Because on the other hand, our sources are much too scarce often, not only according to empirical data, because also these data to talk about. And that's why it's perhaps also to Michael Rose again, this could be a help also to understand the narrative as a resource in a way, because it brings a society in a certain direction. So it's just either a question and also a comment on that.
Does somebody from the others want to say something for that?
Can I comment on this? Since I'm the ABM person. So you're basically asking us to make our agent think like the people in the past. And I can absolutely do that if you tell me how did those people think in the past. So this is not something that a computer can help with. What we can do, what we absolutely can do, is to check whether the way people thought has impacted on the material culture, on the data that we collect, to such extent that we can differentiate between different ways that people could have made decisions. That's the best I can give you. Yes, the agents, there is absolutely no problem whatsoever with them thinking in a cultural way, and as in making decisions in depending on their culture, depending on their individual even character. That's absolutely fine. The question now, there are two questions to this. One is whether those differences between individuals would aggregate to such extent that it would leave a trace on the data. Because, you know, we all make economic decisions every day, which are culturally mediated, etc. Does that impact on, say, trade volumes? Maybe, maybe not. The character features, you know, have enough of a strong influence on, I don't know, how the pandemic unrolls. You know, those are things that we have to kind of check first, whether we would be able to detect those differences in the archaeological record. Because if we don't, then it's just guessing, like, right? I mean, you know, I can have models, people think differently, depending on the culture, not depending on the culture, completely rational, unrational, specific rules. But if the result of those simulations do not give patterns that are similar to those in archaeological record, that I cannot tell you which one are the most plausible ones. So it is in theory possible. I think a higher level of formal definitions would be useful here, because a lot of the terms we talk about here, and you know, I'm sorry to jump on the bandwagon of you know, criticizing actor net theory, but this is one of the examples where the terms are so underdefined and so not operationalized that it's all very, very often difficult to engage with what is it that is being meant, what is the actual, you know, what are the actual rules, what are the actual entities, what is it that we're talking about? And so I leave it to the theorists to formalize their theories in such a way that we can implement them. But yes, everything is possible if we have clean ideas and the best data possible.
Mark, may I answer to Isa directly?
Please do.
So
Yes.
Isa, it was not a question to me if you could not simulate that. It is rather a question to the historians, archaeologists, and all of us, how to come to that data. This is the point, not only by theorizing, but also by observation of our data. And I would say what we do normally is oversimplistic, as we have no other choice to do it, as we all know. But the point is, we have to develop a special theory on that, applying to our material background in archaeology, for instance, to understand what the kind and the way of decision making is embedded in these data. We are not doing that exactly, to be honest. So we're using analogies most of the time, but we are not going to our data themselves to understand that. Sorry, there is a mobile ringing, but I will.
Okay, I don't know. Perhaps if I will just quickly answer or give also a comment on that. So I think if you think about that past, like what Isa said, it's difficult to really know what the people did and how they did things. But what we can do with models, and especially good with agent-based models, is to model hypotheses about different behavior, and also to see if that different behavior, which we can implement in the models, if that could explain, could be a potential explanation for the data which we have. So I'm just thinking of the work I did with Maya. where we wanted to explain different migration patterns in the late Bronze Age in the Adriatic area. And there so we have basically two societies there. And the only difference which we implemented is that one society is more interested in prestige, while the other is more interested in social status. So this is completely behavior driven. And it's a very minute difference, because they are both interested in both these, let's say, social artifacts. Only they prioritize, the one society prioritizes the one, the other one, and it completely drives the simulation. So it's possible to do that, but you will never know if that is the explanation. It's a narrative. But the benefit over a real written narrative is that you have that you can claim with the model and with the simulations and the analysis you did, that this actually is possible to a certain degree, to a better degree than if you would just write the story. And also, like what Isa said before, everybody is free to break it. So you can really disvalidate this hypothesis and this thesis which you generated with the model. You can always take it and tear it apart and find a reason why this, what is really driving the model, which you cannot with written narratives. So yeah, that would be my comment on that.
I'm not sure I completely agree, Frederick, because I think one of the important things about archaeology, prehistoric archaeology, proto-historic archaeology, is that we can't know what happened in the past. And so we only have hypotheses. And so my hypotheses, which are not mathematical models, can be broken and can be played with just as yours can. So I don't think that's a difference. I think it's a strength of both. You know, I think it's very exciting, the fact that we can, one of the most exciting things about your agent-based models, with a group of people talking this morning, is precisely that you can play with it, you can adjust the parameters, you can say what if, and you can construct alternative views and alternative models. But I think you can do that with prehistory generally. And you know, one of the things we all, as people who look at the past, have to accept is that probably the paper we wrote last year is completely wrong, and that it's going to be reworked by somebody else to make something better.
So I think perhaps you, perhaps you got me, or I wanted to be understood a bit different, perhaps, that I think, yes, everything can be falsified, but if you falsify a mathematical model, there is no discussion that it's falsified. Whereas if you say something about a written narrative, you can say just counter with, yeah, but I meant it in a different way. So you have these turns which might be constructive, but sometimes they are not. And whereas if you have a model, and if you know, you need to have the code, of course. So you need to be transparent. You need to have it like a mathematical model. But then you can just, yeah, take your finger and put it in the mechanism and say this mechanism is driving it. And that is, I think that is a way forward, because it can accelerate the discussion. If, of course, everybody knows that every model can always be failed, and that it's not bad to have a model which is falsified, because it's a discussion starter.
Can I just make a super quick comment to that? Because I agree with Mark that every hypothesis can be falsified, absolutely. However, we also all know of those entrenched debates in archaeology, some of which are over 100 years old. And so, absolutely, except for we're not doing it. And you know, I can you know, the case study I pulled to show you. This is the grand question about integration of the Roman economy. That was proposed in the 19th century. And it's not a difficult question. Was the Roman economy integrated, or was it not integrated? Or what was the level of integration? And we're still arguing, and people will not move by a millimeter. So yes, it is possible. It's also not happening. At least not always.
Are there any other comments about?
Yes, I have. I have something kind of relevant question as well to the ABM modeling, because I know under archaeology we also have a branch called experimental archaeology. In each way we try to, for me as a methodology, we try to simulate how the metal smelting or metal production have been done in the past. So I just wondering, for your ABM modeling, is that also good practice? Like, even though your model is a total failure, but it's still worth doing that. So when other people want to jump in this ABM world and try to model this society, is also all right to fail, but it's also a very good piece of work. So that's my general questions for the ABM model. Yes.
Oh, if I may respond to that, I mean, that's not necessarily restricted to ABM, you know, it's a more general question, like, is it worthwhile to publish negative results, which is something that in science in general hardly ever happens, but is still very useful for the scientific community at large to actually engage in these kind of practices, because it shows you what has been attempted and what didn't work. But at the moment, that's not happening, and that's not specifically related to Asian-based modeling. That's just a general scientific problem.
Okay. So is it difficult to publish in the failure model, for example, for you? Or maybe 5 years, I am not trying to curse you or work. I mean, maybe 3 years later, you find, okay, the model doesn't do a very good prediction, but can you still like approach or promote this model in a way like at least the concept model is good, but just the result is not as good as you expected?
Yeah, as difficult as it is to publish negative results in any kind of field, I would say.
Okay.
I have a very quick comment to that as well, because I think the thing we're discussing here is the cumulative nature of science, where the whole point is to build upon what was before, where no one output is likely to kind of stand the test of time, and that is definitely easier when using any formal method. It doesn't have to be ABM, it doesn't have to be modeling, but this is coming back to this kind of never-ending discussions that we have, where the two groups, the two kind of opposite views, they kind of throw arguments at each other, and there's no progress forward. When you can build it in cumulative fashion, where you break one thing at a time and then make it better and better, and then that will allow us to go forward, even if we cannot in the end like truly say what has actually happened in the past. We can probably have a better guesses than we have now.
Constanza had a comment to make, and then Martin Neumann.
Thank you, Mark, for giving me the opportunity to make a comment. I would have two comments if I'm allowed to do so. The one would be, I completely agree, we as archaeologists, we are kind of stubborn and we often are reluctant to change our opinions. And numbers help to solve that problem, especially if you're a younger scholar or a younger female scholar. It's also especially helpful to have numbers to prove some things and to show really evidently that you have to change that. On the other hand, I want to emphasize also the iconic idea of numbers, and we had that already after the 60s and the change from the processual to post-processual archaeology. We could prove a lot of things with numbers. It was very helpful, but there was a certain kind missing in former times. It was religious ideas, narratives. And I think we have a similar, of course, not always the same problem with agent-based model. We can model a lot of things, and then there's something missing. And because we can't formalize that so easy, we leave it somehow out. So we search exactly where the light is and not in the darkness. I'm afraid of that a bit. And the other point is, we discussed a lot that we are not theorizing enough or going into detail. And we have a lot of different approaches, and I want to point out why we are not going in more detail. And that was one of the reasons why we forward or promoted the idea of doing techniques as a knowledge as a resource within techniques, because it's a small scale approach, and we could engage with what, for example, Malafouris has pointed out in the last years with material engagement theory, and we could really try to make a bottom-up approach from the way really basic stuff of Latour's ideas, how to engage with materials, how narratives are formed within this engagement. I think why not really starting from bottom up? Because prestige is already a very high narrative. It's very complicated already, or status relevant, status driven approaches. So is there a possibility to model really these central ideas, like it's, for example, necessary for robotics, necessary for artificial intelligence? Is it possible for archaeologists to start with these very basic things? I think nobody will reply because I was too complicated, or I mixed it up too much.
Shall we move to Martin and give everyone to raise his point, and then we'll come back to you, Constanza, because okay. I think that we need to think about what you were saying. I think I certainly need to engage with it. So Martin, would you like to make your point, and then we'll come back to Constanza?
Okay, because it's not completely related to the point. I wanted to say something to the idea, to the discussion of the narratives quite a while ago. And what we did quite some years ago, more than 5 years ago, had nothing to do with archaeology, but we had a simulation project that we did together with the police, because they were wondering why a group of criminals were killing each other. And then we developed simulation models where we were able to develop artificial crime novels, so to say. So we saw a lot of time series today, also in my presentation. And what we had as a result in this modeling effort was also some time series, but also because we had a lot of police interrogations at hand, a lot of written data at hand, we could write stories, which were, so to say, narratives that Thomas Stern was asking for. And it was what could have been interesting. What we did not, in most of our simulation runs, the criminals or artificial agents killed each other very soon, or relatively soon, because this was what the police was interested. But they were very, very dependent, highly path dependent, very rare runs, which lasted for quite a while. And what we could have done perhaps would have to be developed these novels. We could have written a story out of this, and perhaps see how these stories differ from the stories where the criminals relatively soon killed each other. So this could be a way in which agent-based modeling could also perhaps provide a contribution to the question of narratives, and how the narratives represent cultures that somehow reflect kind of stable, sustainable relationship to the environment. Is perhaps a little bit related to the idea of what is prestige at all, which has been raised, but this is perhaps the only link to Constanza's comment.
Well, I think there is an essential link, which is the question, the extent to which we can model, which was, if I'd understood correctly, one of Constanza's points. She's smiling, so perhaps I didn't. We have two other people who want to speak. One is Frederic, and the other is Valentine. So we'll have Frederic first, and then Valentine, and then perhaps any reactions generally to Constanza or to Martin or to other things.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to perhaps specify a bit more what I said, and also answer then on your question, basically, Constanza. So I think I said in the coffee break that agent-based modeling is like a Swiss knife, and it's also, if you think of the different formal methodologies, it's the one which allows you to do the most, but still you need to make the decisions. That's one point. And also the complexity we saw, for example, part of this complexity being a bit more detailed explained in Angelo's paper, and also in the others we saw which kind of different data sources we have, different assumptions you have to model. So it really gets very complicated to model all this. So obviously you will focus on something and you will miss some stuff. And I would also argue that not everybody should only be doing agent-based modeling, because yeah, you focus on something, you miss out other things, and if you like do something more narratively, you may not do that so easy, because other people will also see the traces of other thoughts and reply to that, and the discussion will be different. So I think it should not be the same like it was in economics with the methodological change from neoclassical, that basically all the let's say vocal discussions were gone and superseded by models, which were very specific kind of models. So agent-based modeling is not that specific, but I still think that agent-based modeling, yeah, is a helpful tool here. And the other thing you raised is, if we cannot start really bottom up, bottom down, and then going up, you could do that. You can model atoms, but there is a limit to what you can do, represent in a computer. And there is also this, I think then this general question, a model is a model because it reduces and not because it represents everything. So that's one problem. And it also becomes difficult. So I think perhaps, I don't know, in 10, 20 years, it might be easier with also quantum physics and quantum computers and other ways of representing such things, which are different than what we're doing now, because then you're again back to, let's say, to functions and to distributions and not to atoms, like what is the scale of an agent-based model, so to say. But currently, I think there is a limit to how much you can put into a model, because you need to be able to run it, to analyze it, to make a sensitivity analysis, and also to understand at least part of it. So yeah.
Thank you, Frederick. Valentine?
Yeah, hello everybody. And I just wanted to make a point about validation. And yes, of course, we do need very much models to explain our fragmentary data, the one that we have in archaeology. The point is that we will never be able to validate the interpretation itself, because we do not have data where we can see exactly how microprocessors, scale up in general events. But so everything is on the model's shoulder. I mean, the model has to be valid. And I will say that we haven't really evoked this problem. The problem is first on the validation of the model. And I think that ABM model can be very much tested also with empirical data. And I'm talking about actualist data, testing also about individual behavior and so on, and how they scale up, in some general phenomenon. And I think the other problem after, it's the analogy that we're going to make with our archaeological data, because at the end, we're always making analogy between the pattern in the model and the pattern in the archaeological data. And that comes to the first question, which was raised about the relevance of the proxy that we take in archaeology. And to go back to the skills, for example, definitely here, we do have probably, when we look at an object in terms of skill, because then you can point out transmission, interaction, and all this. That's probably a very good, good proxies for afterwards. Use our models to explain our archaeological data. So just to say that if I want to wrap up what I said, we have also to think in terms of validation of the model and relevance of the analogy between the model and the archaeological data.
Does anybody want to respond to anything so far? Mikhail, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that there are, of course, deep philosophical discussions in philosophy of science on the use and status of models, right? So there are basically two problems. So how do you get from the real world to the model, right? So what is it exactly what we are doing? Are we simplifying the real world? Are we abstracting? Are we reducing the real world? Or are we creating something totally new, which somehow resembles the real world? So that's one problem. And then, of course, there is a second problem. How do we get back from the model to the real world, right? So whenever we do some model-based analysis, first of all, what we are doing is to make statements about that model, not directly about the real world, right? And then, of course, the question is, how can we translate that back somehow, right? How can we believe that it's somehow credible or informative about what we are actually interested in? But I think that problem relates to any kind of research method in the end, right? But there is this discussion, of course, in philosophy of science, and it's not an easy one. And of course, very often we somehow get intrigued with our own model, right? So, and this is of course a danger, right? And here I completely agree with Constanze, right? So you talked about numbers, we can also talk about equations, and we talk about nice graphs and time series that we are producing. We always have to be aware that it's not the world that we are talking about, right? That's in principle, I think this should be self-evident, but of course it's not, and you tend to forget about this. And so I think it's good that there are these warnings, right? That we should not mistake the model as the real world. But as long as we are doing this, and we always and we are always explicit that we first of all make statements about the model first, right? And then think about how this can help us to understand the real world, then that's fine. And I think in that way, of course, it's always good if modelers are challenged, right? And if people are there who doubt that we have basically captured everything that is relevant, because this of course is the main point, right? How can we know that we have captured everything that is relevant, right? So in order to have something which is useful and credible to make statements about the real world, right? So I think it's never an either or, right? And we always need both in different approaches of thinking, right? In the morning, I opened our discussion referring to complex sciences. And if we agree that the real world, most systems out there are complex systems, then our brains, unfortunately, are too limited in order to understand what's going on. And we need all the tools that we have available in order to get some grasp of what's going on there, right? So this is, and that's my position, right? I would never say that it's neither or, and one is superior to one approach is superior to another.
Do you think there's a difference between representing the world through a model and explaining? Because it seems to me that they're two very different things. Representing is not explaining, it's just a picture.
Whew. Difficult. Isa seems to have a very strong position on that because she was shaking her head. Maybe I need another minute to think about that. Isa, do you want to answer on that?
I will just say what I've learned from Joan Barcelo, who's an IBM modeler in archaeology. And he always says that, yes, there's a difference between explanation and representation. So the model does represent. The goal of the model is to explain. We don't build the model in order to count the pots or to describe the data. We build a model in order to understand what are the potential causal relationships that created those patterns in the data. So the model is to represent the world as well, represent what we think about the world, and the goal is to explain. So I would say
only be able to adduce as explanations the factors that you put in at the beginning into the model.
Absolutely.
So it's still just a representation.
Absolutely. I think this very much kind of comes, as Michael said, to the philosophy of science and the kind of inductive and deductive way of doing science, and also the rule of equifinality, which means that you can never prove anything. You can never ever prove that your hypothesis is true. What you can do is you can disprove it, which is already great, and you can compare different hypotheses and say, given the data, this is the most likely one. But this is also what Valentin...
if I might, in defense of your scholars arguing about the Roman economy, say is that any disproof is based on the information we have at any one time.
Absolutely.
So that's why, unfortunately, we have colleagues who never change their mind, because they'll always hold out hoping that there's going to be new data that will allow their tired and wrong theories to be proved.
Yeah, and I think that there's certain hygiene of scientific process. Part of which is that you know, don't hold too dearly to any hypothesis, however, you know, solid it looks at this point, because people will come, new evidence may arrive. But at the same time, we also have to accept that we create our narratives and our understanding of the past and of the present on the basis of our knowledge now. We cannot predict what new knowledge will come, what will be disproven in the future. So there's always this humility of, well, this is the best guess we can provide at this point in time, given the information we have. And that applies to, you know, everything. So, you know, at some point, if we find, I don't know, a written source, I guess, that says the bloody Roman economy was not integrated, then that would be nice. But until then, we are basically explaining on the basis of what we know now, not what we may know in the future, because you cannot guess what that will be.
Yeah. So now I had some time to think about the question. So it's of course the issue is, well, what do we mean by explanation, right? But what Isa just said, referring to, well, can we disprove things which can be very valuable? This is something that I would like to emphasize too, right? There is this notion of generative social science, right? And the idea is, can we grow a certain phenomenon in our model, right? So the idea would be that we have some observation, some pattern at some aggregate level, could be some record, some data record. And then the question is, we now start forming, hypothesizing where this pattern might come from, what generated that pattern. So we have some hypotheses about behavior at some micro scale. So what agents did, how they behaved, whether they were driven by some rational calculations, by some, I don't know, whatever, culture or something. And then we put it into our model and see what happens. And either we get the pattern, well, then we know, okay, this could be a possible explanation, but we never know whether this is the explanation, whether we have explained what was really going on, or we can't, right? And this is a stronger statement, right? So if some ideas that we had do not lead to a certain pattern, then we know that this is wrong, or something is missing, or that we misunderstood something. So we can rule out one potential explanation that we had in our minds, right? And this is what is often called this generative approach. Can we generate a certain pattern, or can't we? So of course there are often many ways to do it. And if we do, well, the model cannot help, right? Because every potential explanation is as good as any other, right? So the model cannot determine that question. But of course, we can say, given these ideas that we have, it's extremely difficult or hard or impossible to generate a pattern. And then, well, we can move on and say, this doesn't work. We need a different approach.
Can I just add to this general discussion? Because I think we're in this funny moment in history where we've all experienced personally how powerful models are, how powerful simplification of reality can be in terms of predicting things that, you know, we wouldn't be able to predict otherwise. I mean, all of a sudden, all of us have insanely high level of understanding of modeling, especially related to diseases. And the fact that somebody in March would say there will be a second wave in the autumn and the winter will be horrendous a year before this actually happens. I mean, despite what we all hoped for, this is where, you know, we have to really take the understanding we gain first, thanks to that, and see whether we can apply that understanding to the work we do, because it shows the strengths of models, it shows the weaknesses of models, it shows the limitations. Nobody could predict how many people will die. Nobody predicted, but people did predict in the right magnitudes on things for which they had minimum information. Nobody in March knew what the, I don't know, death rate will be, and yet the predictions are roughly in the right ballpark, even for many months ahead. And I think this is something where I think we all should kind of sit down and think, well, actually, you know, this experience should teach us what not to ask questions that cannot be answered, and also understand that sometimes not everything that we know about human society and human nature needs to go in a model. because the models, I mean, you would be shocked if you saw how simple they are. I mean, I could probably knock them out on my computer in like half an hour, the basic ones. So I hope that this terrible situation in which we all find ourselves will actually be useful in that sense.
Are there any other comments? I'm very aware that we've been talking for an hour. I mean, I'm quite happy to carry on, but it's 11:30 where I am. Rafaela, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, just a short comment about the relationships between archaeological data, so the question of Constance Verruden, and modeling. If we think to our archaeological data as resources are not unlimited. And I think a point could be that our data set some limits, puts some limits to the possibility to construct a model. Because, for example, in the nice example from ISA with the sigillata pottery, you couldn't model it in Australia or in South America because your archaeological data is setting some limits to your possibilities. And I think it could be a good start to find a meeting point. So the data are very useful to verify the models, but they also set for our narratives and for our idea, what do we want to model, they set some limits.
Any further comments? So I'm aware that for me it's 11:30, but for most of you it's 12:30, and for our Greek colleagues it's even later. So, you know, do we want to continue? What do people think?
Constanze, you're muted.
Sorry, I just think we should slowly wrap it up. Or Frederick, what do you think?
Yeah, I would also think, because I don't know, everybody has his, we are already beyond the time, half an hour. And I guess everybody has other things also to do. As much as I would like to continue this discussion, because it's very nice. So what I would find very nice if that discussion goes on in your heads afterwards, and also not only in your heads, but also you try to get into contact with all the people which were in this setting in the past 4 days, so 1 evening and three day sessions, and so that we keep that going and take that momentum. And I also think if we look back through the ReSoc time, so what I see is that, if I remember, also in the small group at the beginning, we had a lot of, let's say, even fighting perhaps, but it's getting to a consensus. Everybody understands each other much more about this. I think that's very nice. So it's very constructive. And yeah, perhaps we can take that on. I don't know.
Maybe we should also take the opportunity to thank Mark for making the final discussion, which is really, it is a really complicated challenge after these 2.5 months of sessions spread over 2.5 months. So thanks a lot, Mark, for your input and your help.
Well, if I may say, I think the people we should really thank are the organizers of these 4 sessions, because I've been stimulated not just one morning, but 4 mornings and 1 evening. And in many ways, having it separated in time has been a really good way to let my mind think the issues through, apply them to the next session. And I know that this was second best to all sitting around a table, and perhaps with a beer and talking archaeology, as we all like to do. But I think it has been incredibly stimulating, and in many ways it's been a fitting climax to all the different individual projects within the ReSoc framework. I also think it's necessary to thank the speakers today, who've been very eloquent, who've put forward their case very strongly. Teleevangelism has nothing on ISA and some of the other speakers today. And you know, we've all learned a lot over these sessions. So thank you, everybody. And next year in Bochum, or however we want to say. Thank you very, very much, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you. Hopefully we are actually putting on the final publication, so we should able to have further communication through email and discussion. So just thank you again for your participation. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Have a good day.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Ciao.